This neckline has been finished with bias tape and it's wrapping around the seam allowance. It's an exposed type of finish, very neat. You can use bias tape to finish necklines and armholes and it can be exposed like the one I showed you, or it could be folded into the inside and you can't see it. And I'll be showing you 3 ways that you can finish necklines and armholes with bias binding that you buy in the shop, or maybe some that you make yourself. I'll be spilling all the little secrets and all the details you need to know so that your results can look really, really neat. I'm also sharing at the very end a method I dislike with passion. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing, and today is about bias binding sewing. It's a little strip of fabric, could have different widths, cut on the bias 45-degree angle compared to the straight of grain. Might be a little piece of fabric that scares you a little bit. Maybe you've tried in the past and you haven't been so successful. Maybe you're an expert. Whichever the case, I really hope you can get really practical input from today's episode because this is what it's all about. These little strips of bias are really great because they can mold to curves, so it makes it really adequate to finish armholes which are curved, as you can see here, or necklines that are curved. A really nice and neat way to finish a pattern that maybe has a facing as an option. Maybe you don't like facings, maybe you want to finish it with bias binding, and it's totally acceptable. It is an option that you can choose to do. Other patterns originally have you finished these areas of the garment with bias tape, so it might be something that you want to learn or improve on so that you can be really confident when you make these types of garments. Now I'm going to show you how to do this in 3 ways. I like showing you how to do things in a lot of ways so that you can have an array of options and you can choose which one suits you best. They aren't the exact same technique, but they all use bias tape, or bias binding as some people call it, to finish these areas. I do have a really old video from the beginning of 2019 where I filmed how I finished some sleeveless armholes with bias tape, but it's substandard for what I like to present online. There are some steps that I just skipped. I wasn't that experienced at filming tutorials back then, and I think over the years I have improved, so it's always been at the back of my mind to create a video like that again, have it be 200% better than that one was. So I hope you haven't watched the old one. There are steps missing there that I just did not film. This one is going to have all the steps. First, we are going to see the technique that hides the bias tape inside the garment. You can see this sleeveless armhole. You can see the bias tape, it's exposed. This is not what we're going to see. We're going to see the one where the bias tape is inside, and then all you would see on the outside of the garment would be top stitching. When the bias tape is going to be on the inside, be it for your neckline or sleeveless armholes, most probably just for your neckline, because I know a lot of you don't do sleeveless. You can use store-bought bias tape or you can make your own. It doesn't really matter because you're not going to see it on the inside. It could matter though, because I think the tape that you make yourself from the same fabric you're using is always just going to look nicer. I know there's a whole lot of different qualities of bias tape that you can buy out there. Some of them are pretty horrendous, I have to say, especially the ones made out of cotton. Some that are made in 100% polyester that is super stiff. It doesn't even look like it's been cut on the bias. Could give you a terrible result. You just have to see the quality of the bias tape that you can find locally. I have been asked countless amounts of times for links. I do not have any links, so this is where I need your help. If you live in Australia, New Zealand, in Europe, in the UK, in the US, please comment down below with your local sources and just write there from the UK. Write your country so that other people that watch can find and see where you can source this, because all the bias tape that I've bought, that I've got yards of in all different colors, came from Peru, not online, bought in a street market. Amazing quality. They are made out of satin, poly satin, but the softest, most malleable, moldable. It's just the nicest thing ever. Luckily, I have these rolls of like 100 yards per color, so they are going to last me for years and years to come. So that is my source of the ones I use when I use the store-bought type. It's amazing quality, but I know not everyone has access to that. So if you don't have access to nice bias tape, I suggest you make your own. An armhole doesn't take much. It doesn't take much of it for you to make it. I have a video on my channel showing you how to make continuous yards and yards of it. That can seem a little daunting, but you can always just cut the length that you like from a scrap of the fabric you're using. You don't need to just use up a whole length of fabric to cut your piece. You can definitely get it out of scrap. When I make bias tape to fit the bias tape maker that has the 18 on the back, I cut it 1 3/8 of an inch. That's how tall it is by the length that I need. I'm going to show you in detail how to put the bias tape inside, how to flip it to the inside, how to get it really neat and not be seen from the outside, and also how to join the raw edges together, which is a really important step I missed in the old tutorial. You can see it here. You can do it several ways, but I'm showing you the best way to do it that is going to give you the nicest, more sturdiest and less bulky result inside. So let's see. I'm using store-bought bias tape to finish my sleeveless armhole. This is 18 millimeters wide, a hair under 3/4 of an inch, and I think this is too wide, but I like using it anyway. It's the easiest one I could find, and I have yardage and yardage of this. So to make it narrower, where there's a fold, I just trimmed one of these away. So now I'm left with a regular edge and a folded up edge, and that's the way I'm going to put it onto the armhole. Here I have my sleeveless armhole, the linen, and with any fabric I think is going to stretch out a lot is at the beginning when I'm stitching the neckline. I'll also stitch the armholes, so you can see some stitching there. So I'm going to start pinning on my bias tape from the back. Look, I don't like having the join of the bias tape exactly here on the side seam. I think that's really bulky. You can see my side seam is pressed open. I've serged this separately just because this fabric is heavier. And just around here on the back, that's where I want the join to be. It'll be unseen but less bulky. I'm just going to take my bias tape and put it right sides together here and just start pinning all the way around. But I'm going to leave a bit of area here that is going to be free because I need to join this up later. Okay, I'm going to show you how I join these together. Now you could do the fast method of just sewing them like that, just straight, opening this little fold up and sewing it. But what happens there is that this is bias right here, and you'd be stretching it out and it would turn out really long here and then go off narrower. For sure it's faster to do than sewing diagonally. On bias tape, the grain line is at a 45-degree angle, so this is where it's stable, not up and down like this. So I've got one of these extremes and I've just pinned it there so that it's extended, so that fold is not folded basically. And I'm just going to draw with my friction pen a little 45-degree angle. I've got to make sure I leave myself some seam allowance. Okay, there is my 45-degree angle. I'm going to take this off, and now I'm going to trim away and leave myself a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. I'm going to pin this down extended like this right here, because it's going to help me cut the other side. This one, I want to do the same slanted angle following this shape. So I'm going to overlay this one. I can see through the bias tape where I have my line here. It starts there. I'm going to put a pin. I'm basically pinning where I want this other seam line to be. I wish you could see what I'm seeing, but there's the red line and here's my pin. And I'm going to draw a line here and a line there. Now I'm going to draw a 45-degree angle based on these markings. And now I'm going to trim off and leave myself some seam allowance on this one. This is how my join is going to happen now, at the same angle. So now I'm going to unpin some of this and join it up like this. Make sure to match the raw edges. You're going to have some left over at the back here. At the edge of the fabric, you want these to match right there at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now we can sew this together. This is straight of grain here. There's no stretch in this area. That's why I wanted to join it like this. So this is best practice. It looks nice inside. If you are a quilter, you probably know these concepts, but usually for garment sewing, this is not done frequently at all. Okay, so here we have the join on the diagonal at a 45-degree angle. If you open up your seam, you're going to have this leftover bit right there and over here too. And just trim those things away. And now I've got my bias tape joined. I'm just going to pin it right there. And I know this is going to look really nice and smooth on the inside. So now that it's all pinned, we can go ahead and sew. I'm using a 1/4 inch presser foot again. I just use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for this. If the pattern uses 3/8, I think the difference between 3/8 and a 1/4 of an inch is pretty negligible on an armhole, and I like the precision of sewing with a 1/4 of an inch presser foot, and then you don't have to trim away because the seam allowance is small already. Okay, there we have it. Now, of course, I'm going to snip. I'm going to trim away some of these unravelly bits because I don't want those to get in the way also. Just snip all the way around. The armhole is super curved everywhere, except for this back area that's a little bit straight. So maybe here I can skip an area of snipping, but once you get back into the front armhole, it's really curved. That's why I like sewing with a 1/4 of an inch here. I think you try to sew with anything larger and it's just a little bit more difficult. I'm going to be doing some understitching, so I've pushed all my blouse in here. I have the seam allowance extended right underneath the binding, and I'm going to use my presser foot again to sew right there on the edge. This will ensure that this shiny bias tape stays inside and isn't seen when I wear my sleeveless shirt. I'm always fiddling and touching to make sure the seam allowance is actually under the binding and that it hasn't flipped. If you want to understitch just using your regular presser foot, this is actually more accessible because you just put your blouse in like this, not like when you use the other presser foot, everything's bunched up in here. So I'm just going to sew this one so you can see. Here I have the seam allowance extended also underneath the binding. It is comfortable like this, but I'd rather have the pretty edge stitching with the presser foot, although this can also be very neat. Also looks very nice, very neat. So you can choose, you can do it both ways. Okay, that's how that looks. It looks really neat. And now I can just fold this to the inside. You know, I'm going to hand baste this down and then top stitch. And that finishes the armholes. So I'll just have some fun with hand basting again. I never regret it. It's always so nice. And look, my binding is going to match my satin yoke in there. Here you can see my hand basting with beige thread. I made sure to press this before also and put a lot of steam to help the bias tape conform to the curve. This is why I don't like using a bias tape that's going to end up wider, because it just doesn't conform very well and you could end up with puckers here on this other side. This is my favorite width. Once it's done and everything, it's a little over 3/8. So then we can top stitch at 3/8 and we can catch it right there on the edge. I'm doing it from the wrong side because I want to be neat inside and see when I'm sewing. The stitch looks the same from the other side. I started at the side seam and then I go around. This is how the top stitching looks on the other side. This is how the binding looks inside. Very neatly, you have one row that was under stitching and then the top stitching. You have 2 rows of stitching inside, but on the outside you just have one. I love the finish. And now these basting stitches can come flying off. I make sure to sew them in a place where it's not going to get caught in the seam. So voila, they're gone. As you can see, my preferred width is 18mm. Look, you can buy those bias tape makers that have different colors and sizes. They mainly use the metric system, and at the back you will see some that say 12, some that say 18, some that say 25. Basically 18 means 18mm. It's a hair under 3/4 of an inch. If it says 25 at the back, it means an inch. I would not make bias tape that's an inch wide finished with the 2 folds there. To do this type of finish, it's just way too wide, and I think 18mm is a sweet one that you can make. You can press it and then just trim off one of those folds away, and then in the inside you'll end up with about a hair over 3/8, which is a really nice amount of width to have in there that will conform really nicely to the curve. I would never want to make it with the full width and have really wide bias tape, because even though it is cut on the bias, as further away as you get from the edge, it just gets wider here, and then you start getting puckers. It's not a good look. The only exceptions where I've used bias tape that's a little wider than the 3/8 is when I've used rayon linen blend, because that fabric is so malleable and it just conforms really well. And because it's rayon and linen, it also gives, so it really works with the curves. But I would say that's the only exception. If I'm using polyester, crepe, rayon, linen, anything, I'll just try to keep it narrow, and that always has given me amazing results. Now in the second technique, we are going to see how to do this exposed, which means that the bias tape is actually wrapping over the raw edge. It's not going to the inside. You're not losing any width or height on your neckline, so it's not going to become narrower or lower when you use this technique. So whatever height or width you have there originally from the pattern, that's what you're going to have in the end, because the bias tape will just wrap around the raw edge. It's not like the one we've just seen previously where you lose a little bit of seam allowance as you tuck it in there. It's a little bit different. In this one, you are not going to see me join the edges with the diagonal method. You are going to see me join them straight, which is acceptable. It is acceptable. You will see this a lot in pattern instructions for garment sewing. If you're a quilter, of course, you know the diagonal way to sew them together. The designer has measured exactly to fit the neckline. So I just went the easy way, cut it exactly, it matches exactly, and I don't have to leave any extra to do my diagonal bits. So you will see it is still acceptable. It's just that the diagonal one is better. You'll see me fiddle a little bit for sure. I would still hand baste with any type of fabric I'm using. It's just that for this one, it was just a little bit more special, you know. But let's see how this one goes. I am going to do a guide stitch at 3/8 with a short stitch length, and it'll help me press one of the sides in but also keep it the same length. I'm trying not to let this hang and stretch. I'm trying to hold it in my hand and guide it through. So this is going to help me press this in but also keep it a bit more stable and prevent it from stretching out. I'll just do the same thing on this one. Before sewing the main pieces together, I'm going to finish the neckline because it's going to be easier to manipulate now that I only have 2 small pattern pieces together. So I have my neckline binding here, the short ends together, and I'm going to sew them with 3/8 seam allowance. Your fabric probably won't curl like mine. I have the guide stitch there and one of the raw ends already pressed in to help later. Here is my neckline. You can see the stay stitching that was done earlier. This is a pin marking my center back, and there I have one marking my center front. The binding is calculated exactly to fit this 1-to-1, and I'm going to sew it on the reverse. That means I've got the right side of my binding, the nice colors there, touching the wrong side of the neckline here. And this little seam that united this, I'm going to just pin it right here where the center back is, and then pin the other one at the center front, and then just pin all the way around. Remember, we have a folded edge. That's not the one we want in. We want in the nice flat edge. It's the one that we're pinning right now. If you want to sew it traditionally, then you would sew it right sides together and then flip it to the back and top stitch. But I want to sew it on the reverse, so then I can wrap this around the seam allowance, bring it forward here, cover the seam, and then be able to top stitch from the right side. Okay, here is my binding. I would usually just sew this onto the neckline with pins, but this fabric is sliding everywhere, it's curling, it's just not the easiest to work with. For this one, I have just hand basted it on instead of using pins. That way I'm going to be sure the raw edges are going to be together and I won't be having fabric trying to slide away from me there. It's just sewing this on around. Make sure you're as accurate as you can with the seam allowance, because the binding is going to wrap over the seam allowance, so it does need to be nice and even all the way around. What's different about this type of binding is that because it's going to be exposed, it's going to wrap around the seam allowance like that. So on this curved area of the neckline, you don't need to snip anything because this won't be folding to the inside. It's different when your binding is going to be completely hidden to the inside, and then you have that tension on the curves right there on the edge of the seam. In that case, you would need to snip along the curve, but because this is just going to be straight up like this and the binding will come forward and wrap around it, you can just leave it like it is. Flipped my neckline so that I have the nice pretty side of the fabric. You can see the bindings coming from the wrong side. This is going to be extended like this. This is going to wrap over, and then we had that edge that was previously folded. That folded edge is going to cover that seam right there all the way around. This is another step. I'm going to take my time to pin and hand baste to have the most accurate result, and then I'll go ahead and edge stitch right there. I have the binding wrapped over towards the front. That folded edge is covering the seam and it's been hand basted. So now I'm just going to carefully top stitch this right on the edge. I'm going to start somewhere around the back and just go all the way around. No rush here because I really want it to look pretty. Here you can see my binding finished from the right side of the blouse. It was a hard time for me to pick what color to use. I ended up picking a lighter tone because a lot of the blouse has that type of color, so that's what I used. Nice and neat. I'm happier to do it from the right side because that's what I know is going to be seen, and then I don't need to worry about what's being caught under there because it's already been sewn. So that is why I prefer the reverse way to bind necklines like this. In the example that I've just shown you and that I've filmed, I'm using a pattern that has this originally, so the bias piece was exactly cut to fit the neckline perfectly. It's also come in a width that's going to fit the seam allowances that you needed, 3/8. You know, it's all perfect. What happens if you want to do this anyway on any random neckline where you don't have a pattern piece? Then you just cut your own. I like bias tape finish to be 1 inch wide, because when you fold it over the raw edge, you have enough. Sometimes if your fabric is a little heavier, if it's too narrow, it's going to turn out too narrow here. I use a bias tape maker that has 25 at the back, and my bias tape strip is almost 2 inches tall. So long, but I'm talking about how tall it is. For this type of exposed binding, I would 100% make my own. It would not look good with the store-bought bias tape. I'm telling you, it's going to look awful. I know it. I've done it in the past. It's just horrible. There was one time I made a dress and I used a satin red bias tape to finish the neckline, and as I was pressing it, I just kept hating it and hating it. It looked shiny. It wasn't the same tone as my bubble crepe. So I decided to fold it in and top stitch it again to just save the piece. I really didn't want to seam rip that. So this is the way I fixed this dress, where I tried to just use store-bought bias tape to finish the neckline with exposed binding. Even though it was fine, it was flat, it was well sewn, it just looked horrible. It didn't look professional. And I think that was the last time I tried to do that. That was probably in 2018. So I'm not a fan. I'd rather just make my own bias tape. In this case, I was able to fold it in and save the piece because the fabric was a little heavier. If this had been lighter, it would have turned out horrible. So I suggest you take your time to make just the piece you need for your neckline or your armhole from your scraps, and your garment's gonna look so much better. You see there are some differences here. You see the seam allowance taken is much larger. You do need to have a larger seam allowance because you need that space to wrap your tape around. You can't use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because it's going to be too small for you to wrap the bias tape around, you know. So at least 3/8. That's why your original piece needs to be a little wider also, and it's not as narrow as when I was sewing the one that goes hidden inside. You saw that I don't snip into curves or anything. You don't need to do that because the fabric is not under stress. It's just like it is originally, and all that you're doing is wrapping tape around it, which is different to when you do the other technique. For this one, of course, you can pin and calculate how much you need and do your diagonal thing. You can do it just as well. I just wanted to show you that it can be done sewn straight. Just be careful that you're not stretching it out when you're sewing it. Try to conserve its length. Just do the best that you can, but know that doing it in the diagonal is going to be better. The third option is also an exposed binding. If you look at it, it will look just like what I've shown you here. If you see me walking around, if you see this one, for example, you would think I've sewn it in the way that I've shown you just now, right? Well, I haven't. I've done it a shortcut way. And I wouldn't suggest you do this if you are just starting with sewing, if you're having a hard time handling fabric, and if you have done a little bit of sewing already, you've done some binding and you're feeling a bit adventurous, maybe do it the shortcut way. Shortcut way means that you only sew once. You basically get your bias tape, you have the 2 folds there, you join it to have the length you need. All you do is wrap it in one go, pin it as you go, making sure that the raw edge is right there inside. I hand baste it and then I just sew it in one go. I make sure to hand baste it carefully so that I'm catching both sides, both on the outside and on the inside at the same level. And all I do is top stitch. Sometimes when I feel I can handle the fabric really well, all I do is pin it, and you can see an example here where all I'm doing is sewing, and there's a whole bunch of pins there. I'm doing a neckline and nothing's really moving that much. It all depends on the fabric. But then I have other garments that I've made with chiffon. For example, what you see now, I took my time to baste this really accurately and then top stitch all the way around. When you look at it finished, you'll never know if it was done the traditional proper way where you sew it, you flip it, you know, or if you just folded it all in one go and sewed it. You would never know. But I wouldn't suggest this last method if you're newer to doing this thing. Do it if you want to try something new and you've already got a handle on how binding works. Maybe you'll save a lot of time and a lot of steps. And this is how I would do my binding when I'm not filming for anyone. This is how I get my things done, and I get a really nice result anyway. I do suggest the reverse method though if you are newer to this, for sure. Okay, this is a way that I would not do again, and look, I've done this years and years ago. It's really hard for me to find a piece in my wardrobe that has this type of finish. I would not recommend. It's very ugly inside, it's very bulky, it just defeats the whole purpose. So I've unsewn a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. Basically, what I've seen done sometimes is that you just bind the armhole first, serge it there if you want to, and then you sew the side seam, and then you get this open right there. And it's horrible inside, it's bulky, it doesn't look good, it's not professional. I can feel this bulk under the arm on this sleeveless armhole. And even though I took the time to sew the binding on by hand there so that it looks neat on the outside, this type of finish just defeats the whole purpose of going the extra step of hand sewing this. Yes, this is faster and easier, but it's lacking the whole finesse that we can do in our home sewing. There's no rush. There was no reason why I needed to finish it like this, and I would not recommend at all. I would recommend sewing the side seam and then sewing the binding so that you have the binding cover everything underneath. It'll be cleaner, neater, flatter, more comfortable to wear, and much more professional than something like this. Please let me know in your comments where you source your good quality bias tape, in whatever country you are, because it could help someone else that's looking for a source of nice quality. It can turn out expensive, you know, sometimes they sell you little packets and it only has like 2 yards, and it's not really that cost effective as it is when you make your own little bits out of your scraps from the same fabric you're using, you know. I wouldn't prioritize, let me save all this bunch of fabric to make bias tape. No, I leave it for the end. I cut my main pieces, and then from wherever I can get it, I'll get it. And if I have to join in a place, I'll do that in an area where it's not going to be seen, in a dark area of the print. Doing it diagonally is going to keep it really flat, so I don't mind joining little pieces to get the length that I need. I suggest you experiment with that as well. I hope this was helpful. The lovely silky blouse you saw me sewing, you'll see it very soon, very soon. It is a new pattern, and I took the time to film that technique for you to have it separate, because you can do exposed bias binding with any garment that you want that's woven. Maybe you want a different finish. There you go, you can do it on the reverse. It's always going to be so much easier. I'll see you again very soon. You'll see me a lot for the next couple of days. I'll have a lot of videos for you. And as always, thank you so much for joining, and happy sewing. Bye.